Hello everyone, and welcome to Honeybee Stamps Sealed with Love video hop. In today's video, we are going to create this bold and graphic floral card featuring the new Antique Layering Roses stamps and dies. We're going to start out with that Antique Layering Roses stamp set. You can see here all of the layering parts. It is nicely labeled to make it really easy to identify. You can see here this one says R1, underneath is R2. Those are all the pieces to make that large rose. There's also leaves, a second rose, and even a stem. Here is the guide that you get with the stamp set. This is super helpful. You can see here this rose stamped without the outline. Here you can stamp with that fifth stamp that makes the outline, or it's technically labeled the first stamp. I love that option of being able to have the outline or not have the outline, because today's roses and leaves do not have the outline image. I have a 8.5 by 5.5 sheet of cardstock in my MISTI, and I'm going to start with that first layer for the rose. It's actually technically R2. The first layer again is that outline image, which I'm not using today. I'm going to ink this up in Abandoned Coral. This is going to be my red rose. I always like to start my base image, or my base stamp, which is usually the largest stamp, with my lightest shade. So here's going to be my lightest shade. I stamped it twice in Abandoned Coral Distress ink, and now I'm going to flip my paper around, clean the stamp, and then I'll stamp that rose stamp again. This time in my yellow combination, starting with my lightest yellow shade, which is Mustard Seed Distress ink. You could also use Distress Oxides if you want, but I do like how vibrant the inks are, and the oxides will just be a little bit more muted. Now moving on to R3, which is going to be my second stamp or second layer for these roses. I'm going to pick that stamp up once I get in position, and then I'm moving on to my next shade, which is a little bit darker. This is Candied Apple, a little bit darker than that Abandoned Coral. Just ink it up, stamp it, and I don't have enough contrast from that one stamping, so I'm going to ink it up and stamp it again. The more layers I get on this, the more intense that color is, and I'll have a little bit more contrast between that and the Abandoned Coral, the Candied Apple and the Abandoned Coral. Now I flipped my paper around again, and I'm ready to stamp my second layer on my yellow rose. This layer I am inking up in Fossilized Amber, stamping it, and again I will stamp this a couple of times, ink it up, stamp it a couple of times just to make it darker and have more contrast between that previous shade. Now moving on to the third layer, which is R4. And here I'm going to pull out the guide, and the guide is going to help me make sure I get that stamp perfectly positioned. I'm looking for things that stand out for me, and that's that center part of the rose. So I'm going to line up that center part of the stamp with the center part of the rose image. So just look for things that I call them typically identifiers, things that just kind of stand out in the image that makes it easier for you to line up with your already stamped image. So I inked that up a couple times and fired brick and stamped that layer. Now I'm going to turn my paper around, clean my stamp, move on to my next shade of yellow, moving on to Wild Honey here, ink that up and stamp that as well. And I will ink this also several times and stamp it just to make sure I get it really dark and I have a lot of contrast between my previous shades. So now we're moving on to the last layer. This is R5, and again I'm going to pull out that guide here, and so on the guide there's this little round part, and I'm going to point out here for you right there, that kind of lines up with this little round part here in the rose. So that's my identifier. That's the thing that stood out to me, but that is what stood out to me. Your identifier might be a different section of that stamp. So just really study the image, that guide, and see what you can kind of line up. So I just stamped that layer in Aged Mahogany, my darkest shade of red, and now I'm going to clean my stamp, flip my paper, or rotate my paper rather, and ink this final layer up in Spiced Marmalade for my yellow flower. And I do stamp this a couple times, just like I did with the Aged Mahogany, just to make it nice and dark and get lots of contrast. And that actually completes that large rose. So now we're going to move on to the second rose, starting with the base here for that. So this one is labeled B2. I'm going to ink this up in Abandoned Coral. So I'm going to use the same inks actually for this. It's just on with the different set of stamps, or for this different rose. Stamped it a couple times in Abandoned Coral. Going to flip my paper around, clean my stamp, and then I will make a yellow bud as well. So ink that up in Mustard Seed. Now we're moving on to the second layer, which is B3. Line that up And then I will ink this up with my next shade, Candied Apple, just like I did before on that big rose. Flip my paper around, clean my stamp, move on to Fossilized Amber for this layer as well. And then now we're on to the third layer, which is B4 right here. I can still line this up pretty well without the guide. I'm okay. I can just kind of eyeball it here. So I haven't pulled the guide out yet. I'm going to ink this up in my third shade, which is Fired Brick. Stamp that. Again, I do stamp these and ink these a couple times just like I did with the big roses. Now I'll flip my card stock around, ink up my next layer for the yellow rose, which is Wild Honey, and stamp that a couple times as well. So we're almost done. We have one last layer. I'll point it out here on the stamp set. Here is the final layer. This is the darkest shade. This one's a little bit tricky to line up without the guide, so I'm going to go back to refer to the guide, and I see this little point here stands out to me, and I can see how that lines up with that petal there. So that's how that's what I'm going to look for. That's my identifier. So I lined up my stamp. Now I'm going to ink it up with my final shade, which is Aged Mahogany. Stamp it a couple times and then flip my panel around and repeat this process for my yellow roses. Again, my last shade for the yellow is actually an orange. It's Spiced Marmalade. Stamp that a couple times. And now my roses are done. They're just so pretty. They have so much depth and shape to them. I'm always blown away with layering stamp sets. So there's two leaves here. This one's the first. It's nice and lined up at the top. The second leaf, though, is kind of spread out a little bit more, but again, it's pretty easy to find because they're really nicely labeled. I'm going to actually do the leaf here that's spread around a little bit, just to kind of point it out for you guys. It's labeled L2. Just position that stamp in my MISTI, picked it up. Going to start with Crushed Olive. I stamped that a couple of times, and now I'm moving on to Mowed Lawn, and I'm going to partially ink, just angle that ink pad and just touch it on the very edge of the one side of the leaf, and that adds a little shading to that leaf and really adds a little bit more depth. This is a fun thing to do to your layering, your solid stamps. It just adds a little bit more shading, especially if there's fewer layers. This is definitely something you really want to do. So now I'm moving on to my next layer, which is L3. I'm going to totally ink up this layer with Mowed Lawn. Just stamp it several times to get that contrast, make it nice and dark. Flip it over and then stamp my second leaf exactly the same. And now that I'm done with that layer, we'll do our final layer. So the leaves only have 3 if you don't count the outline. Lined that up, picked it up with my MISTI, and I'm going to ink this up with my darkest shade, which is Pine Needles, and stamp this several times to again get it nice and dark and have lots of contrast between my 3 layers. Flip my panel over and do my second leaf here. And now we quickly have 2 leaves in addition to our 4 roses. I love this kind of trick of flipping your panel around and stamping multiple images. Really handy. I did stamp that top leaf off camera in the same colors. Now we're going to stamp the stem here. There's only 2 layers for the stem if you don't count the outline. Starting with that base layer, which is S2. Just lined that up in my MISTI, picked it up and inked it up now in Crushed Olive. Again, I'm stamping it a couple of times in that Crushed Olive. After I stamp it in the Crushed Olive, I'll then grab my Mowed Lawn. I'm going to do some partial inking again, so I'm just going to angle my ink pad and just ink up kind of the bottom portion of the stem. That'll create a nice gradation over that stamp and add more interest. Now I'm grabbing that second layer, which is S3. Again, this is the last layer for this because there's only 2 if you don't count the outline. Inked that up in Pine Needles and stamped that a couple times to get it nice and bold and have lots of contrast between the other colors. And after I stamped that, I went ahead and die cut these all out with the matching dies. And now we're going to move on to this awesome Mod A2 cover plate die. This also came out in this release. Really love how bold and graphic this is. I went ahead and die cut that out of a A2 panel of 110-pound white cardstock. And now I'm going to angle it. So I could just do it nice and straight on the card front, but I wanted to try something a little different. So I decided to angle it here. And I'm going to use a little piece of tape to hold it in place while I cut off that overhang with a pair of scissors. This is just going to be fun, add a little bit of texture to that background, but not have it everywhere. It's like the edges will be a little bit open, which I think is kind of nice. I'm now going to grab my liquid glue and add just a little bit of glue to the very center. I actually don't want to glue down the edges because I want to pop those up a little bit. I want them to kind of be away from that card base. So I just placed it down, hold it for a second, and then you'll see me here kind of lift up those edges of the the panel. Now I'm going to move on to some watercolor. This is black watercolor from Gansai Tombi. I mix some water in with it, picking it up now with my brush and just tapping my finger to the brush to get these little black splatters over this card front. I am keeping the splatters kind of to the left side of my card. This is going to incorporate my sentiment later, kind of the black for my sentiment. I'm now moving on to the U Buzzword honey cuts. This also came out in this release. I die cut U out of some black cardstock. Now I'm going to stamp a sub-sentiment using the U Buzzword stamp set. I'm going to stamp that Make Me Happy in black ink onto white cardstock. I then trimmed it down to a sentiment strip. Now that my paint is dry, I'm going to arrange my flowers and leaves here. Once I have that arrangement the way I like it, I'm going to grab a piece of press and seal, pick up all of those flowers and leaves. Once I get them nice and picked, nice and stuck, I'll flip it over. And now I'm going to add some foam adhesive to the backside of all of these leaves and flowers. This is going to add a nice little bit of dimension to our card front. So go ahead, remove that backing, and then I will stick this down. Handy that you can look through that press and seal and really make sure you get it nice and centered and back in place the way you want it. So now that those are stuck down, I remove that press and seal. You can see I'm again fluffing, kind of lifting up that panel that I die cut. And here I am getting the U letters nice in position, nice and straight, and then I'll pick them up with a piece of micropore tape. Then flip them over and start to add some foam adhesive. I did place it just temporarily there to the card front, kind of lined it up where I wanted, so I knew where I needed to double up the foam adhesive, or rather I should say not double up. I'm doubling it up on the letters O and U, but on the Y I'm only going to have one layer of foam adhesive because that Y comes in contact with those flowers and leaves that already are popped up with a layer of foam adhesive. I'll now remove the tape on those letters because they're stuck down. And then I'll move on to my sub-sentiment, and I did already add foam adhesive to the backside of this. I had one layer except for the very tail end at the P and the Y and Happy. I did double up the foam adhesive there because that's hanging off of the flowers. Here I am fluffing a little bit again, that panel, and here is the finished card. I'll hold to the camera so you can get a good look at all the details in this card. I love these roses. They have so much depth. They're just so beautiful. You almost wouldn't believe I stamped these. They look almost like they could have been printed, professionally printed. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If you have any questions of the products I used, please check out the links below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.